Everybody. My name is Ben King. I am the Chief Security Officer at Okta for the Asia Pacific region. An absolute pleasure to be with you here today. I'm going to speak about establishing zero trust, one step at a time. As a rough agenda, I'm going to be covering the threat landscape we're staring into as security professionals, the security trends that I see across that landscape, whether it's from what we talk about at Okta or from the many customers around the globe that I speak to. And then I'm going to introduce some research from Okta that we released back in July, which details the state of zero trust at different organizations. It's research we've run over the past 3 years across different industry verticals and different geographies. I find it quite interesting. So I'll be sharing that. There's quite a bit of content, so I will jump straight in. Now, I like to begin any presentation with context. I think it's very important. I know a lot of you will be across all this context, so I'm going to step through it really, really fast. And again, there's a lot of it. But let's begin at the beginning, so to speak. We've had a pandemic 18 months ago. We are all aware of it. We've all been living and working through it for the past 18 months. This has evidenced itself in many different ways. One of them is this acceleration to remote work we've all lived through, and this acceleration of cloud transformation, digital transformation in organizations that perhaps weren't as cloud native or digitally native as some other organizations may be. So for those who really had a lot to do, there was an approach of move first, plan later in the name of business continuity, so to speak, sometimes punching holes in their security fabric just to get things done, to keep the lights on, generating technical debt and security debt that needs to be addressed before those organizations can really pursue their next strategic horizon. Now, that's not every organization, but it's certainly a lot of them, certainly some of the larger, more legacy organizations. But I think most organizations have had to cut a few corners to really push remote work and keep things going in the last 18 months. And now that sort of cleanup's beginning to get rid of all that debt generated. At the same time, with staff remote and new tech being used to enable those staff to be productive remote, we have an increased attack surface, and that inherently brings us more risk and needs to be managed by security teams. Now, against that backdrop, we have more vulnerabilities, and this is nothing new. It's not pandemic related. For the last 4 years, year on year, we've had more vulnerabilities year on year. I take that from the NIST National Vulnerability Database. That's my go-to source there. And those vulnerabilities can be weaponized sooner. We're seeing proof of concepts weaponized again, faster year on year. What used to maybe take months or weeks is more recently taking days or sometimes hours. If I take a step up and look at the macro geopolitical drivers here, we're seeing disruptive tech more and more each year. I'm talking about edge computing, 5G, ubiquitous access to digital devices, the bleed over from the cyber to the physical domains. So attacks where it moves from cyber to physical. I'm thinking about attacks on hospitals and oil pipeline manufacturing and water treatment all in the past few months. These are very scary for populations. I called out digital connectivity already. This is the sum of those things I've just spoken about, but where we have staff and consumers and citizens always online, on their own devices, potentially unsecured from wherever they are. Again, increasing risks depending on what it is, what's the use case we have with those people. Are they employees? Are they partners? Are they consumers, customers, citizens? Against a backdrop of heightened geopolitical tension, cyber and digital tech are a key determinant in the distribution of power in modern intelligence and warfare systems. So we need to be conscious of that. But to bring it back down and back to home, if I think about the people aspect here, I often talk about employees, but staff are more vulnerable, citizens are more vulnerable, consumers are more vulnerable. People are juggling too many balls in an environment where their heads not focused. They need to worry about the environment they're in, what's happening in the world around them, what's happening with a virus, maybe working from home, maybe sharing devices with children to homeschool, maybe multiple people working in the same room with flatmates who maybe they don't know so well. So increased staff and people risk and vulnerability there. We have criminals taking advantage of that as they tend to, really making hay while the sun shines, with a really stark increase in social engineering and phishing and vishing and smishing, often with an emotive lure, as I'm sure you're all aware, and often with a COVID-based lure. So this is very topical for our people. If you get an SMS saying you're at a restaurant with someone who tested positive, please click here in a track and trace type of process, people don't always know what that SMS should look like. So there is that emotive reaction to click before thinking through what's going on. In the world as well, I'm calling out staff burnout, people burnout. People are fatigued from the world we're living in, fatigued from this landscape. We are seeing a lot of turnover. I'm seeing in the media the great resignation being hyped up at the moment. And as organizations seek to buy down that technical and security debt that I mentioned a few minutes before, there's a lot of competition for skilled resource. Now, in cybersecurity, we often speak about the skills shortage. There is a hell of a lot of people wanting to get into the industry, a lot of motivated people wanting to get in, but there really is a shortage of skilled, experienced resources who could be tasked with resolving that technical debt or that security debt that we might have built up by moving too fast when the pandemic hit. So the competition for resource is something that I see and hear about a lot, whether it's attracting the right people or whether it's keeping them as they're poached by other companies. To round out this slide, the bleak slide on landscape, I've called out a couple of the attacks. Now, this is something we could change every week. A couple of the big themes for me that I've seen and been interested to read about: the supply chain attacks, again, not new, but we've seen a lot of them. Ransomware, again, not new, but we've seen a lot of them. Ransomware as a service, not new, but we are seeing it happening in more volume. Now, that's interesting because attackers who might not be less or might not be as technically proficient as others can access quite advanced technical tools to conduct a ransomware campaign for quite a small premium using a ransomware as a service model. Finally, I've called out, and why not combine the two, supply chain ransomware. We've seen it all in the last few months. I know you all have too. So I will get off the bleak landscape slide and move on to something a bit more positive. And these are the security trends I've been seeing in response. As I mentioned earlier, this could be what we speak about at Okta. It could be what I speak about when I'm speaking to customers from Asia Pacific, from North America, or from EMEA. I'm regularly speaking to them all. The first thing I see as a theme, and I speak about quite often, is digital trust in a digital economy. Now, these things aren't new. Trust isn't new, absolutely. The digital economy, e-commerce, isn't new at all. But in a world where we've had a rapid shift to remote, digital trust has become more and more important. We have workers working remotely who need to be trusted by their employers to do their job without being within the office. We have those workers and other consumers consuming remotely and having to trust the online brands they purchase from, whether they're the groceries or something else, that they are getting what they expect when they click a button online. They need to trust the brands. Okta put some research out a good few months ago now. It was called the Zero Trust Index, and we looked at what were the fastest ways brands lose digital trust. And what were the ways to build and maintain digital trust? It's often said digital trust or trust arrives on a bicycle but leaves in a Ferrari. Trust is very, very hard and slow to build, but very easy and very fast to lose. Now, the two biggest call-outs from the research we did on digital trust for me were the two fastest ways to lose digital trust were, firstly, poor ethics. That is where customer data is on-sold or misused in a way a customer doesn't expect or consent to by a brand. That is the fastest way for that brand to lose trust with their customers. And the second was similar but different, for that confidential data to be lost inadvertently to criminals because of poor data security practices. Now, while security and ethics were the two fastest ways to lose trust, they're also the two best ways to gain trust. And that's if an organization has strong security policies and strong ethics policies and makes them visible to consumers or to the end user, they are the fastest ways to build and maintain trust. Users expect strong security and strong data ethics. And if you don't make it visible, they're not going to know, they're not going to have that increased trust in a brand. Underlying all of this, I'm calling out availability. If we're going to work remotely, if we're going to consume remotely, if we're going to do all of this digitally, those services need to be always on. They need to be always available. A bit of a no-brainer there. I'm calling out awareness training. The red text on this page is not about good security practice, although awareness training is good security practice. The red text on this page is about security trends in response to the landscape. I'm calling out awareness training because if our staff, if our consumers, if our citizens are more vulnerable, if they're being attacked with emotive COVID-based lures, or whatever's the flavor of the month this month, we need to make them aware of that. We need to train them against that. If you're phishing your people, fish them with a lure like that one they may get in the real world. User experience is very important for me here as we talk about the tough time people are having in a remote or a hybrid remote world. We need to make that experience for either employees or consumers or citizens as seamless, as frictionless as possible. Now, there's a few ways that I consider very important for this. One is that availability. The service is always on. The user can use it on demand. It's there when they expect it, and it won't let them down. Secondly, I'm calling out single sign-on. We don't want users to have to re-authenticate, re-sign in to different applications or different functionality within an application. We want them to sign on once, remove that friction, and then be able to be productive using those services. But adding single sign-on in isolation actually increases the risk we see from an attacker who may phish or gather those credentials and then use them. They could get access to more than they might have otherwise. So we need to secure that access with multi-factor authentication. Now, this is, again, nothing new or best practice in cybersecurity. A single sign-on plus multi-factor really gives us strong, seamless user experience. I've put an A in front of the multi-factor. That's the adaptive multi-factor authentication, where we make it context aware or risk aware. So if a user is trying to access a page which doesn't have confidential data, maybe a fairly open wiki page, we don't need to fire an MFA. That's fine. They can access that page. But if they want to access some high-risk data, if they want to transact money, absolutely we'll fire an MFA challenge and get them to re-authenticate. This is coming down to that heart of zero trust. Prove who they are again before they do something that adds risk. I'm calling out buy versus build in a world where we have strong competition for skilled resources. As I said, organizations are trying to buy down technical and security debt. There is strong competition for good resources to attract them to a company to help with that challenge. So while holding on to your skilled resource is difficult, we need to get them focused on what is important for an organization. They need to be developing what is the differentiator. They need to be working on the digital trust. They need to be buying down that digital and security debt. They need to be focused on that. So that's the build part. The buy part is not to build commodity services. Where there's pre-existing tools available which are pre-integrated and already compliant in different regions and built to scale, absolutely purchase those. Don't get your staff mucking around with that stuff. Get them focused on what is a differentiator for your organization and plug it into the components, the reusable bits that can be just bought off the shelf and are ready to go. Now, to speak finally on the range of attacks we're seeing, this is where I get into what is the remainder of this presentation, a presentation about zero trust. Looking at zero trust frameworks, architecture strategies, that's how I'm going to talk about how we solve really for this landscape and the range of attacks we're seeing from criminals. So enough said on that for the moment. If I sum up everything on this page, and it's become a very busy slide now, I see this as security leadership's ways to meet expectations. And there are expectations coming from many, many different angles. It could be board expectations, could be consumer citizen expectations, regulatory or compliance expectations, or what may feel, heavier than the rest, media expectations, if you're an organization who might be in the paper. By solving for this landscape, we all have a pretty similar challenge to go after from different organizations with different maturities and different technical stacks. We need to still meet those same range of expectations that are put on our organizations. So I'm going to move now into a bit of a deep dive into zero trust and then onto the research that I mentioned. Firstly, I'd like to call out, in a remote or hybrid world, zero trust frameworks are the answer. And from where we are at Okta, we see identity as the new perimeter. Now, as we've shifted more into cloud, more into remote, the traditional perimeter, if it wasn't dead already, which I'm pretty sure it was, is well and truly dead now post-pandemic. We've got a variety of users needing access to a variety of resources over fuzzy, ill-defined, rapidly changing, poorly secured or unsecured networks. It might be they're seeking access to infrastructure or applications or data via API, either on-prem or in the cloud. Identity is the logical remaining perimeter. Now, that's whether we're discussing workforces and employees signing in, or privileged access users, or third parties and partners, supply chains, citizens, consumers. Identity is the place we can control and throttle that access as we need to. When it comes to zero trust, we really have a framework for every season, and you're probably sick to death of seeing them and reading about them. Regardless of the framework, and I'm going to just show some of my favorites at the moment, of course, NIST's zero trust framework from special publication 800-207, or Gartner's Carter model, or Forrester's ZTX model. This really all boils down to some similar concepts. It is about users and devices getting secure access to enterprise resources in a real-time or near real-time policy or risk decision engine to decide who gets access to what resource and when and with what context in a secure, robust, adaptive, scalable way. To move into the research that I mentioned that Okta put out, I'm going to step through some of that right now. It's called the State of Zero Trust Report. It's research we've run for a few years now. It gauges industry knowledge across regions, industry verticals, and a variety of organization sizes. 2021 survey was on a sample of 600 respondents across North America, Europe, Middle East, Africa, Asia Pacific, Japan, and the report breaks this down into individual countries as well for additional insight. Personally, I'm interested in the macro takeaways and by region, so I'm going to go through some of those today. Now, this first one, for me, it's demonstrating the rise of zero trust security. It's a year-on-year comparison. It's a very simple chart, as you can see. What's interesting for me is that zero trust has been really big in the media for years now, but it's taken a pandemic to push organizations to finally think about implementing it. Now, the Jericho Forum first flagged network deperimeterization in 2003, 2004. Forrester coined the network security concept in 2010. Google released their Beyond Corp strategy in 2014, which is when I thought the media really started picking up on zero trust and reporting on it a lot. And Gartner released their Zero Trust Charter framework in 2018. Despite all of that, you can see in 2019, only 16% of our survey respondents had implemented or were planning to implement a zero trust initiative in the next 12 to 18 months, only 16%. And yet, surprise, surprise, along comes a pandemic in 2020, almost at the same time as we were surveying our respondents. And this number jumped to 41%. And then in 2021, full swing, mid-cycle of a pandemic, we're seeing 90% of our respondents have now implemented or are planning to implement zero trust initiatives to solve for that complicated landscape picture I went through a few minutes ago. So if you and your organization are thinking about zero trust, you're in very, very good company. You're in the 90% there. If you're not thinking about it yet, I would take another look, take another read, because this really is the consensus solution that security leaders across the globe have come to solve for the problems of that landscape. Now, given that we know zero trust is the consensus solution, we've gone the next step further and asked our respondents to rank the requirements of a zero trust initiative framework in terms of priority at their organization. We're seeing APAC, EMEA, North America, and the Global 2000 here. Global 2000 are the 2,000 largest organizations, typically multinationals, to give a bit of a comparison by region in terms of where the priorities lie. Now, what's really interesting is we're seeing people and devices in all regions and the Global 2000 consistently ranked as their priorities in this range of requirements to get done. Now, that's not to say the rest aren't important. For me, this is about, in a world of almost limitless risk, prioritizing limited investment and limited resources to maximize impact. We have seen these requirements shift over time. But now it's about people and device in a post-COVID world. In fact, Gartner singled out identity first, zero trust in their top security and risk trends report for 2021. They released that in April. The rest on the page here is still important, but the risk at the moment and the way to solve for that risk is firmly in identity, firmly in people and device. So let's take a step back. I want to now map these concepts onto a zero trust framework we use at Okta. People can authenticate strongly with a combination of factors, ideally robust, modern MFA. I'm not talking passwords or security questions or SMS. I'm talking hardware tokens, keys, biometrics. Ideally, all of the above are available and a user can select what works for them. Device is great when devices are constant and known and managed. That's not always the case. You've got more luck if they're employees, much less if they're citizens or consumers, much less control you can evidence over a device. So we need to add context there. Now, this is either context we can glean ourselves about what we know of users, their device, their location, could be their time zone or their behavior, could be that strong verification via MFA, as I said. And we can add context we can gather from third parties. Likewise, extremely valuable to enrich our understanding of an access request here. There's a few logos on the page. I really like proof points, very attacked people, or it could be CrowdStrike's device health for example, when we get an access request. We can then use that to build a risk-based profile. Now, that either supports or rejects that a user on a device should be granted access to a resource against an access policy that we've defined with that context we've used to enrich that request data. Now, that resource could be application access, it could be data access via API, it could be infrastructure access, all either on-prem or in the cloud. The resource could be low risk, a fairly open wiki page, for example, or it could be extremely sensitive data and require extensive controls around itself to manage the risk implicit in the nature of the data. And then there's obviously a whole spectrum in between of resources and data which might need different controls. We can then wrap all of that up and put the entire process into our logging and monitoring tools, ingesting everything we can into our SIEM or our analytics tools and orchestration. Note the output of this also flows back into our decision engine to further inform future decisions for the next access request, for the next user and device with what context seeking access to that resource. So there's a strong feedback loop in this model. Now, this is a lot to stare into. It's another busy slide. It's a chunky strategic decision, not a short-term tactical fix. I'm aware that some of you will be well along this journey and some wondering where to start. And there's good news here. The program of work doesn't have to be done as a big bang. In fact, I would never suggest anyone do that. It can be bitten off into small pieces, and even those small bites can have major impacts into your security posture and the risk you're staring into. So look at your needs, your maturity, your risk, and where makes sense to invest for what return in your organization. Now let's dig deeper into the State of Zero Trust report for more insight here. I'll begin by defining the IAM maturity model we use at Okta. Many companies begin with a fragmented approach to identity and haven't really started down the path of zero trust yet. During stage 0, they might begin to embrace cloud technologies, but don't yet integrate those solutions with an IAM platform or run a variety of legacy on-premise resources. At stage 1, teams start wrapping their arms around a unified IAM ecosystem and eliminate poor password hygiene by implementing single sign-on and multi-factor authentication for employees or other users to access key resources. Moving into stage 2, businesses adopt additional security best practice by extending controls to other resources, such as their APIs, and using rich context and diverse factors to better inform authentication decisions. And finally, once companies reach stage 3, they've successfully adopted a full risk-based authentication approach to zero trust, including passwordless and continuous near real-time access solutions. With that defined, the research allows some really useful comparison data to gauge the state of identity and access globally against peers or competitors by specific identity-centric zero trust initiatives. Now, this is a busy chart. I'm showing all global organizations here in green, the Global 2000 in purple. The darker colors are already implemented, the lighter ones are planned for the next 12 to 18 months. So it might be useful to know, for example, that 84% of global organizations polled have connected their employee directory to cloud apps, with another 18% planned. The mathematicians among you may realize this adds up to more than 100%. That is purely because some respondents have implemented an initiative and are planning more work in that space. We can also see the high rates of single sign-on here, but what I wanted to call out next is the comparably high rates of multi-factor authentication. 86% have enabled MFA for employees, with another 17% planned. We can see 48% of the Global 2000 polled have already automated employee provisioning and deprovisioning, with another 20% planned as a big win for efficiency and HR teams there. And 9% of the Global 2000 have already implemented passwordless access, both decreasing user friction and improving security posture at the same time, with other global organizations really chasing to try to catch up to those numbers. So there's some key takeaways here, whether it's keeping up with the competition or ahead of attackers, or simply enabling the lowest friction solution to your employees and your customers. It's a tiny snapshot of what is a very large report with a lot of insight, but that's some of the key things I'd like to share with you today. The last piece of the research I'd like to share is, to finish up, we polled what were the biggest challenges to implementing zero trust at respondent organizations. Now, the top concerns, perhaps unsurprisingly, were skills and funding. This is followed by technology gaps, stakeholder buy-in, solution awareness, and then privacy or data security concerns. Now, I thought it was interesting how every region was calling out a skills shortage, but marginally less so at the Global 2000, probably because they're consuming more than their fair share of skilled resources. Conversely, the Global 2000 is calling out more than proportional concern around technology gaps, which I'd link to their greater legacy tech and greater legacy integrations, I presume, because they're larger, more massive organizations. I'd like to think as the world matures, with regulators as well as the media expecting more of organizations, not to mention customers, consumers, citizens expecting more of organizations, this may solve some of our awareness and stakeholder buy-in challenges as well. So to wrap up my TLDR, my big 5 takeaways from the presentation today are these. Firstly, recognize that people are the new perimeter and adopt strong authentication controls across all your services, whether on-prem or in the cloud or mobile, and do this beyond just employees, add citizens, customers, partners, contractors, suppliers. Next, effective zero trust begins with identity. Centralize your identity and access controls across the enterprise so you can more easily manage risk. This just makes life generally easier for yourself and your team. Number 3, reduce risk by reviewing your organization's maturity and find some quick wins to implement. This is that view of zero trust not being a monolithic big bang, but something you can attack piecemeal to drive down risk with individual investments across a greater zero trust framework. Number 4, extend your security ecosystem by integrating key tools with your IAM solution, thus enabling holistic security visibility and collaboration across your organization. Again, just generally making life easier for you and your teams. And finally, apart from the tactical, more immediate pieces, plan some strategic next steps that will further increase security over time, such as passwordless or context-based authentication, as well as, and I'll emphasize again, shifting beyond protecting just employees to securing access for partners and all users who use your ecosystem. Now, I began this presentation with a title page with an elephant on it, and I'm going to finish it with the same image. When I was asked to speak about establishing zero trust one step at a time, the idiom that got stuck in my head was, how do you eat an elephant? The answer obviously being one bite at a time. This is that view of zero trust being something that can be taken into bite-sized pieces, which can be individually prioritized to maximize risk buy-down, to really maximize return on investment, whether that's dollars or resources, which we need to do in the landscape we're in, and also to evidence to boards and executive teams that we as security leaders are getting stuff done with something to show for it. There was a lot in there. Thank you very much for your attention. The report I went through is available for download at okta.com. There's a lot more there, but thanks very much.